From the European Parliament here in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is what we have on the program. Summit breakdown. Why high hopes in Hanoi came crashing down at a meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. Nuclear fears from North Korea to Pakistan and India to Iran. We are in a new era of nuclear proliferation. Macho politics. Female world leaders warn women's rights are being eroded as strongman politicians rise. Hitting a bad note. As Ukraine quits the Eurovision Song Contest, we ask, is the competition becoming too political? And look who's talking. The elusive North Korean leader takes questions from the foreign media for the first time. All right, it is time to meet our panelists this evening. We have Darren McCaffrey, our political editor here at Euronews. Darren, which of these stories are you watching?
It definitely has to be Eurovision, and the answer to that question is yes, it has become way too political. It's all based on who your neighbours are, who you like and dislike. Let's get back to the music.
It has been political, though, over the years. We'll talk about that later. All right, joining us tonight also is William Dartmouth. He's an independent British MEP. What about you, William?
Good evening, good evening. Well, about the Eurovision Song Contest, I'm always conscious of the fact that the UK seems to do terribly bad.
Never wins.
Well, there you go. All right, also joining us tonight, Shada Islam. She's Director of Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe. What about you, Shada?
The Strongman story from the female leaders who say there's time for a pushback against these nasty, populist, mostly macho men.
All right. But first of all, tonight we begin in Vietnam. The signing ceremony was announced. The working lunch was booked. But in the end, it was the art of the no deal. American President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, they failed to agree on a plan for denuclearization. Now, the North Koreans wanted sanctions lifted entirely before disarmament could begin. Now, for the Americans, that was a step too far. Let's take a listen to Donald Trump to explain why talks broke down.
You always have to be prepared to walk. I could have signed an agreement today, and then you people would have said, oh, what a terrible deal, what a terrible thing he did. No, you have to be prepared to walk. And, you know, there was a potential we could have signed something today. I could have 100% signed something today. We actually had papers ready to be signed, but it just wasn't appropriate. I want to do it right. I'd much rather do it right than do it fast. Yeah.
All right, first of all, before we went into that meeting, I think the bar was set pretty low on this meeting. But at the same time, I mean, surely negotiators knew that North Korea would ask for sanctions to be lifted. Was this a massive failure? Then I'll ask you, Shada.
Well, I'm disappointed. I think it is a bit of a failure. And of course, Donald Trump has walked away, but he's left behind a very volatile situation, not just in the Korean Peninsula, but we also have the entire treaty, the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, in disarray. The US has pulled out, Putin has pulled out, Russia has pulled out. So we have a very volatile situation. There is no rule of law for arms control. And of course, as you said, India and Pakistan are also at each other's throats. So I'm very, very concerned.
I think it depends on whom you ask, obviously. But some would probably say, well, actually, it shows strength on Donald Trump because he can walk away when he doesn't like the deal. Is there a point to that? Well,
I think that's probably true, but I'd also like to make the point that when Donald Trump first got elected and the sort of smelling salts were being administered all round, lots of people said to me, of my acquaintance, are really, really worried about there being war between the United States and North Korea. Now, the fact of the matter is that successive US administrations, including the Obama administration, has tried to deal with North Korean problem unsuccessfully for the last 40 years. And at least Donald Trump had a go at actually talking. I take a rather different view. I think the likelihood of coming away with anything was actually fairly remote. And there's actually a reason for that, because you may remember Kim Il-sung, the North Korean dictator, will be conscious of the fact that Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons and Gaddafi ended up in a ditch. Now, that was partly because of the completely crass policy of then French President Sarkozy and British Prime Minister David Cameron, but it makes it much, much more difficult to get dictators to give up their nuclear weapons.
Sure, and Shada was pointing out, I mean, we'll get into the global implications a bit later on, but what I wanted to ask you, Darren, is should the US probably have just said yes to lifting of sanctions for the sake of denuclearization?
To coin a phrase, or to steal one, actually, from Theresa May, maybe no deal is better than a bad deal. And I think, you know, from Donald Trump's point of view, this does and it is in some ways a sign of strength. But it is also for Kim Jong-un as well that, you know, they have stood their ground on this issue. in saying that, I actually do tend to agree with William that Donald Trump actually sounded reasonably presidential in that press conference, something you couldn't accuse him of being terribly orphan. In addition to that, he is trying to tackle this, and he's made progress in the sense that at least there is dialogue, which there has not been for decades between whoever was in charge of North Korea and the US presidency. And by all estimations, you know, Mike Pompeo was saying this afternoon that he thinks there is still the possibility of a deal, whether it takes a couple of weeks or a couple of months, that a deal can still be done. So, all in all, you know, it is failure, of course it is, because there is no deal to sign, but I think overall, compared to where we were 2 years ago, North Korea and US relations are a hell of a lot better than they were when he was calling him Rocket Man. Yeah,
so maybe when you said watching that, maybe we can we breathe a sigh of relief, in fact, because there were worries going to this meeting that if you leave them two together in a room, that Donald Trump might actually give way too many concessions that he should be giving.
Yeah, I mean, also, you know, when Darren talks about being presidential, I think we should stop looking for presidential in Trump. That's not presidential. I'm sorry, you know, when people say that, I think no, but I come to your point, and it is true that it is important to keep the dialogue open with North Korea. Seoul is doing it, South Korea is doing it, China is doing it as well. So, you know, we tend to focus very much on US and North Korea, and that's right, because that is the main, let's say, the main antagonist in this issue. But there are other countries around as well, which have a major say in how this is going to evolve. So I'm going to be looking very much at what Seoul says, what the president says in South Korea, how China reacts, how Russia reacts. Sure. This is an international issue. And I think you're right, Darren. Channels of communication are open, but let's keep them open.
No, and also, right. just on you know, the sanctions are not simply just in place because of nuclearization. Sure. You know, North Korea's got one of the worst human rights records on the planet.
Perhaps the worst.
Sure.
Perhaps the worst.
Possibly the worst. And you know, those sanctions have to remain in place unless the regime changes itself too.
Yeah. All right, and just to elaborate on Shala's point, I mean, this is not just a North Korea-US problem. Indeed, it is global. Now, with all eyes clearly focused on the Korean Peninsula, the question is, are we actually losing sight of the global picture Shala was bringing up when it comes to nuclear proliferation? Well, Alex and our team in theCUBE have been looking at the wider context for us. Alex.
Well, really interesting, Tessa, hearing you discuss there. So while the world was watching these two in Hanoi, talking, you know, shaking hands and all of that in Hanoi, two nuclear-armed neighbours, tensions between them reaching boiling point, jets shot down, prisoners taken, of course, India and Pakistan there. Two nuclear-armed nations who really are at a crisis point. It's certainly been viewed as that. Look at this, these are the words from the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan saying, I ask India, with the weapons you have, the weapons we have, can we really afford a miscalculation? So the idea here, with this crisis going on at the exact same time that the eyes of the world are on discussions with North Korea about denuclearization, are we missing the point? Well, Paul Ingram, he is an expert on nuclear non-proliferation based in London. He certainly thinks that we're all getting distracted. This is what he had to say to me earlier in theCUBE.
So the reason why North Korea is so much of a focus is because it involves the United States directly. But the potential flashpoint in South Asia between India and Pakistan has always been more serious in the immediate term. These two states both have over 100 nuclear warheads apiece. They have fought wars even whilst possessing nuclear weapons, the only countries to have done so.
100 nuclear warheads apiece pointed at one another at a time when Pakistan has promised to return the prisoner they took. But you can see these are real tensions, a real situation here. But let's go back perhaps to one of the oldest, well, the oldest nuclear rivalry, the United States and Russia. Let us not forget the INF treaty signed by these two men, Mr. Gorbachev there, and then these two have come along and withdrawn. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump both pulling out, efforts ongoing to try and save the INF treaty, with both the United States and Russia pointing the finger at the other one. Fears here of a new global nuclear arms race kicking off between the United States and Russia. But then what about those nations who want to get in on the nuclear club or have wanted to? Well, let's not forget the Iran nuclear deal. The whole point of that was to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions. The United States has pulled out. Europe is keeping the deal on life support. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia. Now, this is interesting. A report released by the Congress, the Committee on Oversight and Reform, let me just pull that up for you, saying that they have credible information from, as they say, multiple whistleblowers warning about efforts inside the Trump White House to speed up the process of passing on confidential nuclear information to the Saudis. Why does it matter? Saudi Arabia and Iran, of course, arch rivals fighting a proxy conflict in the region. The idea here, any suggestion this is going on, will be viewed in Tehran as a potential threat. So you can see here, Tessa, when we're talking about the issue, it is much broader than simply the United States and North Korea. When we're looking at the world's nuclear club, you can see how dangerous this is and how many potential flashpoints there are in the bigger picture.
Indeed. Thank you for that to Alex and our team in the Cube. Willem, I'll ask you this. Do you think the world has gotten a lot more complacent than we were probably in the 90s about nuclear proliferation?
I mean, I'm not an old timer, and when we were constantly worried about it, and when I was a schoolboy, there was a thing called the 4-minute warning. The theory was 4-minute warning before nuclear annihilation, and the thing would papers used to run stories saying, what would you do in the 4 minutes? Now, I find that report very perceptive, but also intensely depressing. And the fact is that it's a much more complicated world. Many more people have got, many more countries, I should say.
Is it more dangerous?
Have got nuclear weapons than had in the 1990s, and that has to be more dangerous.
Right.
And I'm not sure there's any flip solution.
And Shada, when the US pulled out of the INF Treaty and then the Iran Treaty, has this set off a domino effect, in fact? Has Donald Trump actually triggered the speeding up of nuclear proliferation in the world? Is that,
in a sense,
is it fair to say that?
It is fair to say that, because you need treaties, you need arms control treaties. When you withdraw, you're really leaving a free-for-all, and that is what is happening at the moment. Now, just to come back to India and Pakistan, and it is true, they're nuclear armed, and it's a very dangerous and volatile situation. But I think it has boiled up. But I think it's now simmering down again, and that is to the credit, I have to say, to the leaders of both sides. Pakistan has released a pilot who was shot down, so, you know, that's brought down tensions. And on both sides, there's a recognition that this is just about how far we can go without creating enormous tragedy. So there is a deterrent effect of the nuclear weapons as well. And that, I think, is something we need to remember as well. Do you remember that was the case in the 60s when we did talk about nuclear deterrence between the Soviet Union and the United States? And that kept the peace. And that kept the peace.
It sort of worked,
yeah,
actually.
Exactly. So in that sense, you could say they're on the same page, India and Pakistan. It's a horribly tragic situation. I want war to go down. There are other challenges now for both countries.
Are we now in an era of free-for-all? There is no official platform,
we are onto, and these things do rise up. And I don't think the United States necessarily leaving the treaty. Ultimately, after Russia had been flouting it for years, and really with an attempt to take on China, as much as it is about Russia for the United States. But when we look at those countries that are aspirational nuclear holders, places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, you know, that is because of regional threats, not global ones. It's not, they are not getting nuclear weapons because they want to take on the United States or indeed Russia or China. It's because of regional powers, i.e. Saudi Arabia and Iran. The impact is great, but I think it's too easy to lay all the blame at the United States door when actually ultimately, just because they've withdrawn from a treaty, which, you know, for a very complex reasons, doesn't mean that it should be a free-for-all. The countries involved have to take responsibility.
Is there still a legitimate way to talk these days? Because even during the height of the Cold War, Russia and the United States had channels.
They're always talking. Always talking.
Exactly. So have we lost that now? Is there no way, no official platform for adversaries to actually
Well, it seems that it's got much more complicated, and there's more players. It's more complex. It's like coalition governments. It's always more difficult, and that seems to be happening. I think it was Mr. Gromyko. I mean, the Soviet Union had the same ambassador in Washington for 30 years or something, and they were always talking. Even then, a book's come out saying that nuclear war was only just avoided because of.
So what is?
I don't think today, though, are we genuinely any closer to a nuclear war today than we were 20 years ago?
Well, we have irresponsible leaders. This is what I worry about, and I agree with you.
More irresponsible than before?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think there's irresponsibles, there's fake news, there's a lot of show. We have presidents around the world that are really just about show, the deal, the no deal. It's not about the detail, and these things are crafted on responsible leadership based on details. The devil has always been in the detail, and in the past, there were diplomats, the kind you're talking about, who knew the details and who could actually talk to each other. They respected each other. They don't do that now. And when the US withdraws, Darren, it does leave a gap, OK? they are the anchors. They were the anchors. And the world has to get used to America not being the anchor, the guardian anymore.
Yeah, and they have to take responsibility for it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. Okay,
and there's
last point, because we don't have much time. Okay.
There's always a danger that one of these states with nuclear weapons becomes a failed state.
Yeah.
And that's a
bigger problem.
That is true.
The miscalculation.
Well, there you go. Miscalculation indeed. All right, we'll leave that conversation there for now because there's a lot more coming up on Raw Politics. The trolls are coming. How Russia plans to interfere in the upcoming European elections. Plus, the politics of machismo, why a group of female leaders are blaming populist strongmen for the erosion of women's rights. That's next. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, strongman politics is chipping away at women's rights. That's according to one of the founders of a group of female world leaders who penned an open letter signed by more than 24 dignitaries. It says, quote, above all, we seek to underscore that the risk posed by politics that seek to halt and erode gender equality is a risk not only to women, but also to all of humanity because half the population is prevented from contributing to its full potential. Now, the letter comes as the appeal for populist politics rises around the world, from the elections of Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Now, the strongman style of leadership is seen to be growing support. All right, let's go now and talk to a former UNESCO Director General and Bulgarian politician, Irina Bokova. She's one of the co-founders of the movement behind the letter, and she's joining us now from Paris. Ms. Bokova, thanks very much for being on the program. I think, okay, first of all, what I'd like to ask is, how is this idea of strongmen politicians, macho politicians, and populist politics undermining women's rights?
Well, thank you for inviting me to express what we think about the sleep of the gender, I would say, agenda nowadays. Let me say that already our appeal has been joined by 33 former women leaders in the United Nations, heads of agencies, former prime ministers, presidents, funds, programs, and the secretary generals, because we are worried about, first and foremost, the undermining of multilateralism. And multilateralism has contributed enormously to the agenda of women's rights as human rights. We should not forget that it was thanks to the United Nations, to the multilateral platforms, that we have the Beijing Action Plan. We have also Resolution 1325 of the Security Council on women, peace and security. We have the goal number 5 on the Agenda 2030 on gender equality. And we have, of course, reduced child mortality, maternal health, access of girls to education. And now when we see that this multilateralism is undermined, in fact, it means also undermining of all the efforts for women's rights and women's empowerment. And we all, with Susanna Malcora, Helen Clark, my friends and former colleagues that started this initiative, we are all alarmed of what is happening. Yeah,
you are talking about the undermining of women's rights. So going back to that point, I do want to know, because we see a rise in the trend in populist politics and strongman, so-called strongman macho leaders. How does this contribute to the deterioration of equality, of gender equality?
Well, actually, this type of, I would say, of backtraction on women's rights very often are expressed in kind of populist approaches, very often linked with nostalgic overtones about time when, in fact, women did not enjoy these rights. And we do believe that we have to turn the tide, that we have to resist, we have to counter this narrative, because we think women's rights is not just an agenda for women. It is for all the societies, for communities. At the end of the day, it's about social inclusion and social justice, I would say. Everybody should contribute to a society's well-being. And this is what we see nowadays undermined by the rise of such populist trends.
All right, just very quickly, Ms. Bokova, how do you push this agenda forward? What solution do you see? Just very, very quickly.
Well, you see, we are just a broad network of women who care, who are not indifferent, who are alarmed, who have contributed to the elaboration and adoption of this agenda. I think we need to make very strong advocacy. We need to go and talk to these leaders. We need to mobilize the civil society. And also, I believe with our experience, with our kind of a moral authority also, we can do a lot more in the future to turn the tide about this politics.
All right, thank you very much for your insight there, Ms. Irina Bokova. She's the former UNESCO Director General and a Bulgarian politician. Now, joining me in the studio to discuss this is messaging expert and Director of Red Thread Communications, Laura Shields. And still with us is Shada Islam from Friends of Europe, as well as British MEP William Dartmouth. All right, I'd like you, Laura, to react first to what Ms. Bokova there was saying, this undermining of women's rights by the rise of the kind of rhetoric that we see, which is across the world. It's not just in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the rhetoric, I think you are right. When it comes to strong men, I think it's important to differentiate between strong men and strong leaders.
Sure.
Because everybody wants strong leaders. I mean, who doesn't want a strong leader?
Or macho politics, as we, another word to say.
But strong men are associated with certain qualities. They very much engage in us and them. So whether it's gays, anti-Muslims, fear of the outsider, you know, in Putin's case, the whole strongman narrative was built largely to mask the fact that the Russian economy was doing very badly and that internationally the country's being marginalised. In Hungary, you've seen Orban using sort of, well, George Soros. I should imagine George Soros, their hatred of George Soros probably unites all of the strongmen. And then also Bolsonaro very famously had supporters who ran a disinformation WhatsApp group basically talking about gay kids in schools. So they do us and them. They talk in very toxic, inflammatory language a lot of the time. But the key thing to understand in all of this is that whilst a lot of people find this appealing, if you don't like it and you want to manage it, the best thing to do is not to react to it. And a lot of the time, we don't see people reacting very carefully or intelligently to this kind of language. They just pour petrol on the flames.
So I will ask William, a man, what is the appeal of strong men and macho politics from your point of view?
Well, I don't think it is so appealing, and I'd also
you don't think it's appealing?
I'd also make the point. I'd also make the point that over the years there have been many very strong female leaders. As I said before, I'm an old timer, and I remember Mrs. Mayer, Mrs. Gandhi, and certainly Mrs. Thatcher from my own country. And actually, I think that those three were probably stronger than any male leaders have been. And I also think that the lady in the film mentioned child mortality. I don't think that President Bolsonaro of Brazil wakes up every morning and says, I want to increase child mortality. I don't think it's like this. The fact of the matter is that women are more equal, and rightly so, than they ever have been at any other time in human history. And I think that this is basically a mistake. And if you disagree with particular leaders, you want to disagree with them on the merits of their policies, as I do. And not just call them names.
But the bar is quite low.
The bar is low, but also,
I don't think it's very productive.
But also, William, when Bolsonaro or others wake up in the morning, they don't say, yes, so many children will die. They say women should not have their rights. Birth control, health situation, they don't worry about that. That is very important. Women's rights should be at the center of our policies, whether it's development policy, whether it's foreign policy, defense policy. Countries are spending more on arms, on weapons, than they are on health and education. They're not worrying about the kids. 130 million children, Tessa, girls, children, do not go to school. They're going to grow up to be disempowered women. We need to get those girls in school. And Ms. Bokova is right about a narrative, but it doesn't have to be a counter-narrative. We need to have a positive narrative, a really powerful narrative about how women matter to the economy, to the politics, to the business, to every single
Rather than a gain for women is a loss for men or something like that.
And it is very fundamental to all our policies. We need to get real with that, William. Sorry, we need to recognize there is a pushback by these so-called strong men.
And Laura, I'd like to go back to you on imaging, because we saw there Vladimir Putin, you know, with really a macho image. But is this all about form and messaging, or is there something to be said about the politics, the substance of the politics, and what people believe that these men can bring as answers to the problems they see in society?
Well, I think strongmen deal in sort of very black and white stereotypes about the world and visions of power. You know, protection frames and strength frames. Strong fathers are obviously incredibly appealing to their base. And actually, if you think about it, whenever President Trump is feeling a bit vulnerable, what does he do? He goes off and does one of his massive rallies where he fires up his base because it gives him strength. I think if you're going to move it away from that, though, I completely agree with what Shada was saying. But if you look at the United States, in the midterms, there was a wave, or a blue wave, and a lot of those were women. And they weren't just women who were fighting on women's issues. Exactly. And in fact, if you run on women's issues or women's rights, you will lose. But when you run a very local campaign which really connects with what people want and you listen to them and you find common ground, which is not the same thing as centre ground, the candidates that did the best, whether it was in Kansas or in New York, are the ones that really understood that and were mixing their own personal story in with the policy aspects and also talking about bread and butter issues like childcare, caring for the elderly and work. And all of these things really make a difference. So if you want to fight strongmen and macho politics, you don't fight them by pouring fire onto the flames. You do it by communicating on issues and being very practical and very focused and not reacting to
the fact that you say that
noise.
there's something to fight against, does that mean that masculinity is appealing?
No, I don't. Yes, I do think. I think there is a certain. And I would also say that this kind of masculinity does appeal to men and to women. I also think when people are worried about things, it's understandable where this comes from. But also, in terms of what William was saying before, women vote far less than men. So one of the reasons why we see the rise of strongman leaders is probably yes, women do vote for them, but they don't vote as much. And actually, if you look at somewhere like Hungary, Orbanism is a direct threat to female empowerment. I mean, only last week, a couple of weeks ago, he announced these tax breaks for women who have more than 4 children. You know, they would be taken out of tax. He has also consistently portrayed women working or women with children working as being anti-family friendly. Now, so in that sense, that if more women come out and vote, they generally make better choices for themselves and their children. And so that's why it's really, really important that more women do get out and vote. But they also need the kinds of people that they would vote for. That's not necessarily women. But it needs to be something that represents their needs more.
All right. William, would you like to react to what Laura was saying in terms of fighting this with issues-based politics?
Well, I actually agree with 95% of what you said.
What's the 5%? What's the 5%?
Which is a bit of a worry. I won't be asked again. Basically, I think that the film we saw earlier on, it's a bit of a cul-de-sac, which is actually being put forward. Certain people, as has always applied in politics, have certain views and certain ways of putting things forward, and certain views, and they've got to be countered with actually differing views, and that's exactly what you said. Now, the fact of the matter is that everyone's obsessed with President Trump, but a majority of a majority, I can't use the word white, a majority of white college-educated women voted for Trump. And I mean, that is the fact. What does that tell you? And perhaps we'll talk about it. It tells you something was wrong with the Clinton campaign, is what it tells you.
Well, it does, yes.
Oh, well, that's what we're going to talk about perhaps in a moment.
Chada, we don't have much time.
I just want to say something about these so-called strong men. They are really quite weak because they rely on oppression and repression and simple messages. And they do not have the confidence of their people, many of them.
Under every strong man is an insecure little boy.
It's a very insecure little boy.
On that note, let's turn to another country now. Let's go to Spain, because former Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy, he has appeared in court to give evidence in the trial of 12 Catalan separatist leaders. Here's his take on the issue which nearly tore his country apart. Let's take a look.
Realmente a veces resulta sorprendente que alguien pueda pretender hablar con el presidente del gobierno de cómo se liquida la constitución del país de la que esa persona es presidente del gobierno. Es decir, yo en ningún caso, admití ninguna conversación sobre la soberanía nacional y sobre nuestro texto constitucional. España es la que quieran los españoles y no una parte de los españoles.
Think about that, former Mariano Rajoy testifying there in that trial.
Well, in terms of how he comes across? Well, I think he's behaving like Rajoy, which is always quite defensive, basically. I mean, what's interesting, and whether wherever you sit in terms of the sort of Catalan independence argument, one of the things that makes it all quite complicated is that they did have an illegal referendum, and that actually Rajoy's response was to go in very heavy-handed on rule of law.
Messaging is such a key part of this.
The
as well,
messaging was
isn't
a key part of it, and he's never behaved with any kind of empathy or understanding, and it was always a bit heavy-handed. But the fact is that it was an illegal referendum, so you're getting into very muddy territory in all of this.
Well, there you go. Do you have something to add, William?
Yeah, well, we in the UK have a very strong Scottish nationalist movement, actually, which is even in government there. And I simply find it absolutely unimaginable that the Scottish nationalists would be prosecuted with the state asking for prison terms of up to 25 years, which is what the Spanish government is doing. And the Spanish government is doing it with absolutely no criticism from the European Parliament at all. And that's the disgrace. And that's because the successive Spanish governments subscribe to the European project, and they're therefore given a buy on this.
Well, some people might disagree, but...
It's a complete obliteration of European values. It's an outrage. What's going on?
All right.
If you want to know what I think.
We will leave it at that for now. But coming up on Raw Politics, has Eurovision become too political? Ukraine's favourite pop singer thinks so. Why the country's nominee dropped out of the next song contest. That's coming up next. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, Facebook, Twitter and Google are not doing enough to protect the European elections from interference. That's according to a Commission report, which calls out the companies for falling short on their disinformation strategy that was launched in December. Well, the Commission identified little progress on the priorities, including scrutiny of advertisement placements, transparency of political advertising, closure of fake accounts, and marking systems for automated bots. All right, some monitoring groups say that these shortcomings could make the EU more vulnerable to online attacks from Russia specifically. Well, joining us now live from Spain to talk more about this is Fabrice Poitier, disinformation expert and senior advisor on the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. Good to see you there, Fabrice. Now, you know, there's a lot of warnings on the dangers of interference in elections. What new evidence have you seen in terms of specifically coming from Russia on these platforms?
I think the new evidence are mostly about the big vulnerabilities that we in Europe have vis-à-vis a power like Russia. And it's three Ps: people, parties, platforms. People, because I think we are all vulnerable to disinformation, to some fake news campaign, as we saw during the Gilets jaunes demonstration in France, for example. Parties, because some political parties are actually producing themselves fake news or are actually vulnerable to hacking. And finally, platforms, because as you said in your introduction, the big social media platforms are basically not doing enough to create trust that indeed they are secured and that they are not going to be a place where people can be fooled.
We've talked about in the past about the vulnerabilities of the European Union, especially with the elections coming up. And you said before that Ukraine was a testing ground for these Russian hackers. What about the upcoming EU elections? Is this going to be a much bigger testing ground for these hackers?
Yes, but as often, well, first, it's not only hackers. It's more diffuse than that. It's dirty money, it's fake news, it's traditional hacking of political party servers or electoral commission. So it's a more multidimensional strategy. It's not a one-shot strategy, first. Second, as you know, there are many member states, all member states involved in those elections. And I think you will have to watch for the weakest links, where the Russians or other foreign powers will have an interest in meddling. And the weakest links are obviously the small member states who are, easier prey, but also the bigger member states where if you manage to really disrupt the electoral process, you can earn real dividends by having more radical or more populist MEPs in the European Parliament.
Okay, and Fabrice, so finally, what is the end game? I mean, if this is going to be, a testing ground for finding the weakest link and how they can succeed at influencing elections, what is the end game? What for? Why is this being done?
Well, it's done, I think, to shame us as Democrats and as, belonging to a system we call the democratic process. And it's just about disrupting, confusing, creating doubt. It's not necessarily about getting some certain people elected, even though I think that's a second objective that a power like Russia appreciate. But moreover, is to really shame democracy. And I think what we have to do is to be resilient as citizens and resilient as political parties. And this is why, for example, the Transatlantic Commission I represent has put forward a pledge for European election integrity, where we ask all the candidates and all the parties to take a 5-point pledge for basically not fooling around, not using the tactic of Russia.
All right, thank you for that, Fabrice Poitier, an expert in disinformation, joining us from Spain there. Thank you. And here with me in the studio to discuss this is tech journalist Jennifer Baker. And still with me is Shada Islam from Friends of Europe and British MEP William Dartmouth. Jennifer, I'll start with you. You know, what Fabrice was saying there, I think what I understand from his last answer is that this is about ideology and it's about, you know, the concept of democracy rather than getting someone in particular elected. I mean, that's not a primary goal. Do you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, I think it's, if you can be seen to disrupt elections, then it reduces the public faith in the outcome of those elections, and that makes the entire social fabric more unstable. And I think that is probably the overall aim, rather than a particular policy in the Parliament or anything like that.
And from a technical tech point of view, what is the weakest link, really?
Well, the Commission came out today with a statement saying that the big social media companies aren't doing enough. Well, quite frankly, the European Commission isn't doing enough either. It left it till far too little too late for this code of practice on disinformation. It was put together very, very hastily at the end of last year. They had 4 meetings, this high-level working group, before they came up with the practice. And the practice is, OK, it avoids real regulation, which is, of course, what those big tech companies want, but it also is kind of meaningless. They've got these targets on bots, so they've got to identify fake accounts, disrupt these bots and take them down. But we don't know what those numbers mean. Is a high number of bots being found and taken down a good thing? Or is it a bad thing because, oh, there are more bots? And if the numbers come down, then is that because they're identifying more of them and they're taking them down? Or is it because there are fewer of them out there? So transparency is great to come up with these numbers and so on, even though, based on today's report, they're not really doing so much and even doing that. But the transparency and numbers are no good unless you're actually understanding the story and the meaning behind them. And the Commission doesn't seem to be doing that.
All right, and from a more, I guess, most personal point of view, William, as a politician, are you aware when you are being a victim of fake news?
Well, I'm actually very sceptical about this. First of all political campaigns since time immemorial have featured rather false facts and sizzles. Even the great Tony Blair.
So you think this is no different?
Well, it always has. Now, and the other reason why I'm very sceptical is we've had two big elections. We've had the referendum result in the UK and the election of Donald Trump in the US, both of which were elections which the establishment didn't like. And therefore, instead of saying, well, look, we, the establishment, ran lousy campaigns, and that's why these people... And that's why these people won, and they lost. They're saying, oh, it must have been interference, it must have been a thing. Yeah, I'm very, very dubious about that. Now, also the point that you made with great clarity was we've got the European elections coming up. The European parliamentary elections are very likely going to have a result which the European establishment are not going to like.
But then,
with a lot of parties who actually disagree with them. So the first thing they're saying now is they're bound to be interfered with so that they can question the result.
I'm going to ask Shada, because, you know, is that irresponsible to say, oh, well, all politicians lie anyway, and all campaigns are based on... I mean...
No, not quite what I said, but...
I know,
but, you know, I am worried about foreigners hacking and, you know, interfering with our democracies. But we ourselves are undermining our democracy. I think, you know, some of our politicians... Brexit was based on misleading fake news.
I can't agree with you. That's what I'm saying.
So Orban, at the moment in Hungary, fake news about Jean-Claude Juncker and George Soros. What was said about the Aachen Treaty by the French tabloids and the German tabloids, that this was a kind of giving away Alsace or whatever. We are destroying democracy and the credibility of our democracy ourselves. So, you know, I'm you know, yes, there will be foreign interference, and then I think we have to be aware of it, prepared for it. Forewarned is forearmed. So let's, you know, get that message across. But let's also work on ourselves and reinforce what we have. Are we so weak that every little thing that destabilizes us?
Jennifer.
Well, I mean, I agree with what Shada is saying there. I mean, part of the success of fake news is also that if real politicians are saying things that are so outlandish and so outrageous that you believe them, that the fake is sometimes not even as outlandish as what actual politicians are saying, then some of the responsibility lies there. And I think we're now in a space where, from a tech point of view, so-called deep fakes, where you can fake the video and the voice of someone, is becoming more and more sophisticated.
upgrade our skills.
We need to upgrade our skills, but we also maybe need to have politicians acting in a more somber, sober way, so that we're not fooled by these crazy videos that look like them, sound like them, and increasingly will be difficult to distinguish from a real person. If we can say, well, he would never have said that, then that's where it comes down to understanding media literacy,
pulling back
training.
the rhetoric.
And, you know, we talk about young people.
Okay, last point, Chada.
No, we say, you know, let's warn the young people. I think it's the older people who are the most easily duped. So let's have to work on the older people because they're voting for the populists.
William is smiling.
Poor chap, exactly.
All right.
I'm over 65.
He's smiling.
I'm over 65.
All right.
So.
Let's move on to our next story because watched by millions of people across the world, Eurovision season is here, but it's off to a rocky start as Ukraine pulls out after its nominee accuses it of using her in a row involving Russia. Let's take a look. Remember her? She's Russian singer Yulia Samailova, who in 2017 was caught in the middle of a clash between Russia and Ukraine. It all played out over Eurovision, when the singer couldn't perform in Kiev after being barred from the country. Not quite the battle of the bands viewers had in mind. The decision inflamed an already tense relationship between the two countries, who have been fighting since Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014. Now it's happening again, but this time it's Ukraine who have decided to pull out of the contest. That's after its nominee, singer Maruv, said she refused to be used as a political tool in an ongoing row with Russia. And two more artists also refused. Retaliating, the state's national broadcaster accused the music industry of having, quote, systematic links to the aggressor state, and said it could no longer participate. Okay, let's go to someone who says she has a lot of thoughts on Eurovision. Has it become too political?
It's always been political. From the very first day, you know, there were always groups of countries that always voted for each other. Then there was a whole political scandal about whether or not you should be allowed to sing in English.
So you don't think politics is ruining? It's part of it, is what you're saying?
It's part of it. I mean, it's part of the sort of the background fun. If you're not into the music, I'm actually more interested in the arguments that go on. You know, there's also a big argument this year about whether many gay people are boycotting it happening in Tel Aviv.
Right.
There was, you know, a scandal about whether the French didn't want people to be allowed to sing in English, and you know.
I mean, but there are real implications, political implications. She didn't want to be used as a pawn, you know, as a quote unquote.
I think, you know, pop stars have messages to pass as well, and I think, you know, they're becoming very political. But, you know, I don't watch Eurovision. I'm a Queen fan. I'm all for Freddie Mercury. So if he's come back, you know, then I'll be watching something like that.
William, do you watch Eurovision? Yes or no?
Well, I remember ABBA winning with Waterloo.
Okay, well, there you go.
Quite a long time ago.
I think that answers the question. All right. Well, coming up, do you think Eurovision has become way too political? We want to hear from you, so just stick around in the next hour for your chance to call in and tell us what you think. Contact information is on your screen about now. You can call us at 00800 3333 7002. Email us at rawpoll@euronews.com and join the debate on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook. Use the hashtag #RawPolitics. Our lines are open now after the break.
You know, people here go to church and they wear hats, they wear scarves.
This is fundamentally focused on Muslim women. This is a form of racism.
It's nothing but an individual mindset.
People are not open anymore.
This is it's kind of like you disrespect the freedom of religion itself.
I wonder whether Karl Lagerfeld had brought out a Chanel version of this if the French would find that more acceptable.
Welcome back to Our Politics. So you just saw there the highlights from last night's Your Call program. Now, we were going to have that today as well because you've heard from the politicians and we always want to hear from you. Here are tonight's hot topics in Your Call.
If you destroy my country, I will kill you.
From America to Russia, Asia to South America, and even here in Europe, so-called strongmen are seizing power. As more than 30 prominent female leaders call out the rise of what they call macho strongmen, we're asking, what's the appeal of macho politicians?
I do not want to see Article 50 extended.
Perhaps not, but with Theresa May opening the door to a Brexit delay, there's a chance that the UK might have to take part in the European Parliament elections in May. But after 2 years of Brexit deadlock here in Brussels, we want to know, should British MEPs be banned? Bringing countries together. That was the aim of the Eurovision Song Contest when it launched back in 1956. More than 60 years later, politics is creeping in. Ukraine has pulled out after its nominee refused to sign a contract barring her from performing in Russia. With a territorial dispute stealing the spotlight, we're asking, is politics ruining Eurovision? Have your say, Europe. What's the appeal of macho politicians? Should British MEPs be banned? And is politics ruining Eurovision? Now, all of the contact information you can see on your screen now. You can call us for free at 00800 3333 7002. Send us an email to rawpaul@euronews.com. And on social media, use the hashtag #RawPolitics. And you can look for us on Skype because we'd like to see you as well. Well, joining us now is Shona Murray, our Brussels correspondent with Euronews. And back with us, Jennifer Baker from BrusselsGeek.com and Shada Islam from Friends of Europe. All right, Shona, we were talking about the topics today. You'd like to talk about the strong men.
Yeah, there's the erosion of women's rights.
The appeal of macho politicians, actually.
Well, but those 30 former female leaders and current leaders are saying that there is a correlation between the erosion of women's rights and the rise of the strong man. So is that the case? And also we want to hear from people if they think that they admire strong men and that they'd be more inclined to vote for stronger men, they feel more secure. Maybe strong men have this more sort of law and order type of populism around them. So we want to hear from people why people might vote for
clearly
strong
that
men.
point of view exists when we see strong men getting voted in a lot of elections.
Yeah, I want to hear from people saying, is there too much Putin on Euronews at this raw politics? Too much pictures of bare-chested. Too many pictures of Putin raw, bare-chested.
Does it have an effect?
Oh, well, I think, we're showing too much of him. No, I'm joking. But seriously, I mean, do we need men like that? No. Leaders,
people like that.
No,
and
no.
Jennifer,
people like that.
Well, I think strong man as a term for macho men is probably wrong because I think it's probably masking quite a great deal of weakness underneath it. I don't know what the appeal is. They don't appeal to me. So, yeah.
I mean, we do want to hear from people with a different opinion, so do call us in. Call us tonight, your call. Also, you were talking about Eurovision. You said that Eurovision has always been political. In fact, it's not creeping in, it's been political.
There's always been
politics. Isn't it being used as a
in it.
platform then?
It is, isn't it? I mean, yes, in certainly the case we were talking about today with regard to Ukraine and Russia, there's little infighting things, and I think that's unfortunate.
But does politics ruin it?
I don't think it ruins it. I mean, you can still watch it on the level of enjoying the pop.
It out, though. Like, that's the thing. I mean, Ireland won the Eurovision 5 times, and a lot of it is because many in the UK voted for Ireland because so many Irish people live there. But the Irish never voted for the UK.
Arts are political. Look, the Oscars are political too. Look at the speeches being made, and that makes it more interesting.
But now Ukraine is not part of it. No artist, no musician.
But sometimes it's good to use it as a platform, like for LGBT rights, which is happening this year. So, if you want to get involved in the political platforming side of it, do. If you want to just enjoy the music, you can do that as well.
You were saying the Oscars, got political as well. But should the arts world, should be insulated from
No,
politics?
because art can be used for peace, art can be used for war, and I think art can be used for reconciliation and political messages.
For art as well,
for political messages. And in the world we live in, people listen to celebrities. The artists, actors, pop stars, they have a role to play.
I don't know how many people listen to Eurovision entries.
Exactly. But I mean...
Okay, but it is Eurovision season, as you were saying earlier. And look, all of you can get in touch with us. There are many, many ways to get in touch. As we've said, you can call us at 00800 3333 7002. Email us at rawpaul@euronews.com. And look for us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and use the hashtag #RawPolitics. We're always on our phones checking for your use of that hashtag, and look for us on Skype as well. All right, before we go, let's have a look at tonight's Raw Moment. Let's turn back to the Trump and Kim summit, because some 3,000 journalists from around the world made their way to Vietnam for this summit, but only one became the first reporter to actually get Kim Jong-un to answer a question. Here's tonight's Raw Moment.
Were you confident?
Thanks, David. Thank you very much.
Well, it's too early to tell. But I wouldn't say that I'm pessimistic. From what I feel right now, I do have a feeling that good results would come out.
Thank you, guys.
Well, that was a big moment.
Yeah,
What do you think,
time we'd
Sean?
ever answer a question. I mean, not honestly or whatever, but he answered a question from a member from the press, unprompted or you know, non-contrived.
Yeah, is it a one-off or?
Oh, I'm sure it's a very one-off. Yeah, I'm sure. I wonder where the whereabouts of that reporter is as well. I hope he's safe.
But that's it. That was a really good moment, especially for journalists. All right. Now, we would like to hear your views again. Call us in our call-in show tonight. We gave you all the information. Call us at 00800 3333 7002. We'd like to know what you're talking about. Look for us on social media. Use the hashtag #RawPolitics. Have a good evening.